This morning my heart is sad. I am tired. This sermon was recorded before the riots and looting that we saw Friday night in Atlanta. Violence only begets violence and solves nothing. I pray that we will not be distracted from God's call for justice for the oppressed, marginalized, and downtrodden. People are hurting. Systemic change is needed, and God calls His people to lead the way. Lawful, peaceful marches and protests are the way. Hoodlums are tools that Satan seeks to use to close our minds to those who need our open ears and open hearts. May God heal us. May God heal our city and our land.
I'm tired. And I suspect many of you share my sentiment. And it's not entirely mine, it's one that I hear a lot of people say. Barb mentioned even this morning when I was talking to her about it, says, I'm tired, I'm weary, I'm frustrated. A friend of mine on Facebook posted the other day, okay, I'm frustrated, angry, sad, tired. Hashtag George Floyd. A couple of seminary classmates of mine, one of whom many of you know, Karen Woods, posted this week, and Karen actually posted a few weeks ago, a Facebook series of things that is going around that starts out, black people in America are so tired. And then it lists about 40 things about tired of not being able to do daily activities we take for granted. Kind of things known a few months ago as living while black. Tired of not being able to go to Airbnbs and not be thought to be criminals and the like. We're tired because our country is under attack by two viruses. The novel coronavirus and the virus of racism. One that is relatively new, one that is very long-standing, has been around as long as our country and virtually as long as Europeans have been on the American continent. And the two viruses are connected. For you see that the people most ravaged by COVID-19 are those whose suffering often is unseen because they're marginalized by society. The elderly, not just the elderly, but oftentimes the elderly that we have put on a shelf in a nursing home somewhere and forgotten about. I'm not trying to say that every senior facility that has been stricken by the coronavirus fits that model, but many do. Particularly when I read about many of the facilities that didn't follow proper procedures and had a record of not following proper procedures. Many of the victims of coronavirus, both as in positive cases as well in deaths, are persons of color, are poor. The working poor that are unseen, African Americans stocking groceries, making deliveries, Hispanics and other ethnicities working in meatpacking plants, black and brown people of all occupations living in close quarters with multiple family members, living in densely populated apartment buildings, stricken by the coronavirus. And then the virus of racism. The names go on and on, but the recent ones include George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery here in our own state of Georgia, Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, and then just this week, examples of white privilege. Christian Cooper in New York City, where a white woman who had her dog unleashed against the rules was asked to leash her dog by an African-American bird watcher, Christian Cooper, and she threatened to call the police and in fact followed through with her threat to call the police and say that an African-American man is attacking me and my dog. She knew the power that accusation would have. Those of you who were on our Wednesday night call heard me mention an incident that Barb experienced Wednesday morning in downtown Atlanta. She was walking to work from the MARTA station, as she always does, and there was an African-American gentleman walking ahead of her with a backpack. He was walking a little bit slower than she was. She ended up walking past him and then came to a traffic light, and they reconnected. And he looked at her and said, "I hope you don't think I'm following you." I have no idea where that came from, if it just came from a concern of his, or if it was a concern because of the Christian Cooper situation, which had just been in the news. And then Friday morning, during the protest turned into riots in Minneapolis, you have a white CNN reporter, Josh Campbell, reporting, and the state troopers and police move in, clearing the area. He's asked for identification. He shows them, and they say, "You're okay," and go on their way. A block away, an African-American Hispanic CNN reporter and his crew experience a similar situation, only he's arrested. They're all arrested and taken to processing. Graphic display of the difference in being in white in America and being of color in America. We're infected with two viruses and they're connected. Today is our last sermon in the Encountering God series. And it's kind of a transition sermon because we're going to look at Paul's encounter, or originally Saul of Tarsus' encounter with God in the form of Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus when he becomes Paul. And it's also a transition because we're looking at his encounter today, and then for the next 8 weeks, we're going to have a summer with Paul where we're going to look at Paul's writings and more in depth at his teachings and theology. The most prolific writer in the New Testament. You may say, what exactly is the connection between Paul and our viruses? And I would say, hang in there and let's see. But also, one major connection, and I think one lesson we can learn from Paul's story, is we can hold very firm, even zealous views politically, religiously, socially, and then learn that things are different. That maybe we're misguided in our zealotry and in our adamant beliefs and representations. That's the lesson that Paul learned. Let's take a look at Paul's background. Paul grew up in the city of Tarsus. It's a city that was a Gentile city, not a Jewish city in present-day Turkey. And we don't know a whole lot about Paul except that he grew up there probably in a tent maker's family, because there's mention of Paul being a tent maker, and there is some mention of his parents there. There was a Jewish community in Tarsus, probably a pretty small fraction of the population. And Paul grew up there, and at least many scholars think, and much of his writing and what we know of him leads us to believe that Paul was a scholarly person. He was probably a child prodigy in many ways, really very caught up in studying Scripture, in studying the Torah, the Hebrew Scriptures. And we know from Paul's writings that he went to Jerusalem to study under rabbis there and became a Pharisee. And we'll be looking at this in greater detail in coming weeks as we look at Paul. But sometimes Pharisees get a bad rap in that they're all wrong, one-sided. Let's just understand for right now that a Pharisee was a part of Judaism, part of Jewish belief in Paul's day and for a while after, that believed very strongly in studying the Torah. That's Paul's background. And Paul was zealous in his background. So today's story, we get the beginnings of that background in what Melissa read earlier, where Paul explains that to King Agrippa, but then Paul moves from his background into Paul's story. And there, Paul's story is what happened to him on the road to Damascus. He says, you see, I was a zealous Pharisee. I was seeking to protect the law, protect Jewish tradition. And I was upset and concerned that there were a group of outcasts that were following Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, we know from earlier in Luke's Gospel in chapter 9 that Paul referred to this group of followers of Jesus as the Way. And we'll talk about that a little later. But Paul says that I was persecuting the Way. I put many of God's people in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many times I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. I was so obsessed with persecuting them, I even hunted them down in foreign cities. That's what I was doing on the road to Damascus. He was going from Jerusalem to a foreign city, to Damascus, to persecute followers of Jesus, the Way. And Paul tells Agrippa in his story that suddenly there was a light brighter than the sun that blinded me, and we all fell from our horses. And I heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Then I asked, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. So Paul is telling Agrippa what happened on the road to Damascus. We frequently call this Paul's conversion. Professor Dr. N.T. Wright of the Anglican Church in England and many other scholars say that's really a bit of a misnomer, because Paul didn't convert from one religion to another or from atheism into Christianity or something. Paul never ceased seeing himself as a Jew. All Paul did was transfer his zealous belief in the God of creation, the God that promised total freedom to God's people, the Jews, release from bondage and oppression, into one who understood that God's promises in the prophets and in the Old Testament were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So for Paul, it's one continuous story. He realized that his zealousness was misguided, and we see that in Jesus saying a phrase that's odd for us, but it's hard for you to kick against the goads, against the animals, against the ox. And what Jesus is saying is, Paul, I came to fulfill God's promises. I came to do exactly what you have been hoping for. And yet you're resisting me. You're kicking me. You're resisting. Paul, believe in me and realize God keeps his promises. So Paul did, and that leads us to Paul's hope. God had a plan in Jesus fulfilling Paul's hope, and Paul expresses it this way in the story. But God has helped me to this very day, so I stand here and testify, just small and great alike. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. That the Messiah would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead would bring the message of light to his own people, and then to the Gentiles. That God would repair what was broken at the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. That God would reconcile God and God's creation. That God would bring a ministry of reconciliation through Jesus and ultimately through Paul that we'll be looking at in coming weeks between human beings and one another. That's the connection with these viruses that are afflicting America. Jesus came to bring reconciliation between us and God and between us and each other. Paul was resisting it because he misunderstood it. And if we don't understand Jesus' role in correcting injustice, God's desire to bring justice, and God's desire to use us to bring justice, then we're kicking against the goads just as Paul was. And our text today closes with Festus, the governor of Galilee, telling Paul, you are out of your mind, Paul. Paul was talking about resurrecting persons, Jesus being resurrected and fulfilling God's promises. You are out of your mind, Paul. And if some of us say some of the things about bringing racial and personal reconciliation to our world and seeking to change our world through Jesus Christ, we're going to be called crazy too, just like Paul. Paul's hope is our hope, our way and our hope. I mentioned earlier that in chapter 9 of Acts, Luke recounts Paul as calling this Jesus movement the way. What a better metaphor for our Christian life as to say it's our way. It's the path that God calls us to. And ironically, where was Paul when he was brought onto the right path? He was on the way to Damascus. He was on a misguided way, and Jesus brought him back to the true way. But what is important too about this metaphor of the way is it shows that it's an action. being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus Christ isn't just talking, it isn't just believing, it's acting on what we believe and what God calls us to do. Paul was a Jew who believed in the goodness of the original creation and in the intention of the Creator to renew his world. His gospel of salvation was about Israel's Messiah inheriting the world as had been promised in the Psalms. From Paul's perspective, the coming of the Messiah in Jesus Christ was the launching of a heaven and earth movement. Heaven coming to earth as Jesus taught us to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So what can we do to bring hope, Paul's hope, God's hope, our hope, to our lives and our world, to our way of living? And it really boils down to two words: listen and humanize. We need to understand people who think differently than us, and especially people who don't look like us and whose experiences are not the same as ours. People who are tired of being discriminated against solely because of the color of their skin. People who are tired of seeing themselves choked to death as a white police officer kneels on their neck. I can't relate to that. And many of you can't either. That's why we need to listen to people who can identify with that. Jesus had a couple of things to say that are relevant. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. But we can't do that unless we understand them. We have to listen. Another text that I think fits in well with this dual virus that we are afflicted with right now is from Leviticus 19, verses 32 through 34. Stand up in the presence of the aged. Show respect for the elderly and revere your God. I am the Lord. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. COVID-19 strikes the marginalized and the social outcasts. We must no longer be silent. Earlier in that chapter in Leviticus, Moses, or the writer of Leviticus, writes the word of the Lord, saying, do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor, or by being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. Do not spread slanderous gossip among your people. And here is what I want you to hear this morning. Do not stand idly by when your neighbor's life is threatened. We must hear our hurting brothers and sisters. Dr. Martin Luther King, in a speech over 50 years ago entitled The Other America, said, I think that America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. And I'm going to stop for a second to interject. He's speaking over 50 years ago, But if we have ears to hear, he could have said this yesterday. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. True in the 60s, true in the 20-teens into 2020. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice has not been met. We're making progress, but the progress is all too small and too slow, if we're honest. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. So what is it that we're not hearing today beyond what Martin Luther King said 50 years ago? We are tired. We are human beings. Please hear us. Am I next? A seminary classmate of mine posted on Facebook in response to the George Floyd murder words that I think ring very true. What we have is much deeper than just racism. We have a dehumanization problem. When the white masses start to see black and brown people as themselves, then we can possibly start to make inroads towards conciliation. That's my friend and fellow minister, Corey Brown, a man of color speaking. We would do well to listen. And if somehow those words put you on the defensive, then listen to Jesus, whom I quoted earlier. Do to others as you would have them do to you. See others, especially those who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't vote like you, who don't believe like you. See them the way you see yourself as a human being and treat them the way you want to be treated. The way I want to be treated. With this I close. Am I next? Canangela posted a video about 40 seconds or so long of a young African-American man, Kedron Bryant, with a beautiful, powerful, passionate voice singing a song. He sang, I just want to live. God protect me. I just want to live. We may not realize it, but we have responsibility to answer his prayer and help him live. Pray with me. Lord God, we come to you confessing how we are misguided at times. We get so wrapped up in our beliefs, we get so wrapped up in our world that we don't see what you're trying to do in other lives. Forgive us, but most of all, Lord, help us who are white. Help us who have little reason to fear violence from the police who are supposed to protect us. Help us to listen. To listen to those who are not sharing the same experiences we have. And then to turn to you and ask, what would you have us do? And to listen to you. So that we can truly love our neighbor as ourselves. as Jesus showed, and we pray in his name. Amen.